want to intro it?
Yep. Welcome to the Todd and Taylor Show. I'm Taylor Trask.
And I'm Todd A.
And we had recorded a podcast previously where we were going to talk about two different Netflix shows. You with Luke Cage, me with a little show called Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. However, if you listen to that one, we got so excited. we went a little long. We got a little excited about Luke Cage. So we decided to bump my show to this episode. So in this episode, I'm going to be talking to you about the little show on Netflix called Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell.
Which I'm all sorts of interested in because in a lot of ways it is very opposite from Luke Cage.
Oh, yes.
Very much. One of our running themes of like, how many episodes do you do for a season? This was BBC maybe? So it's just 7 episodes. It's, you should set it up for me. What in the world is this show about?
Said a little different from Luke Cage. Luke Cage is about, black folks in Harlem. Mr. Norrell and Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell is about pasty white people in England in the time of Charles Dickens, I guess. No. So it's actually, it is a show that it's not a Netflix original, but damn, does it feel like it. It was produced by the BBC and is actually based on a book that came out in, I don't know, like the
2004.
early 2000s. Yeah, around that time. I knew it was kind of like in the time of Harry Potter. And I know that because when that book came out, Barnes & Noble and Borders and all those places were pushing it pretty heavily as like,
no kidding,
the adult Harry Potter. And I was like, ooh, what is that? And the cover was very sort of nondescript. So it was kind of like, wow.
Yeah.
And I remember seeing it, but I just never really picked it up. I had a couple of friends that did. And
yeah, it has a great ampersand right in the middle of the cover.
Yeah, it really does. And so when this came out when they were talking about making a series, I remember IO9 and a bunch of different sites were really excited about it. And we're talking about it happening. I didn't quite get the hype. And then sure enough, it found its way to Netflix and was quickly in the sort of trending lists that they give you. And I just popped in, one day, a couple weeks ago thinking, okay, I'm just going to check this out and just see. And 2 days later, I'd finished the whole damn thing off and was just blown away. And have since actually rewatched it again a second time.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it is great. Let me kind of backtrack a little bit. So it's one of those shows that. Well,
let me stop you right there. When did it actually come out on BBC? Do you know?
That's a good question. I think. Hang on, miniseries.
In the last couple of years, though, right?
Oh no, very last year.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
wow,
Summer of May of last year. When you and I were starting the Todd and Taylor Show, this was happening. So it's been around that long. Then Netflix had it, and I think word has it that it's so popular on Netflix that Netflix is jonesing for them to do a season 2, which is a little awkward because the BBC I think has the rights to it. They've got to do it. Here's the thing though, if you've seen a lot of, and don't get me wrong, the BBC makes great content. Everything from Doctor Who to even that, they're kind of made for BBC movies that they do. But this was kind of on another level, right? This felt like an HBO show. This felt like a Netflix show. And it really, so it was weird to even think of it as being a BBC show because it just had all the cinematography and sensibilities of, again, an HBO show of Game of Thrones. Like, I'm just weird that it didn't appear there.
So you literally just sort of knew about the book, but you just sort of dipped your toes into the series once it was on Netflix. It's not like you came into it like a big fan, like knowing exactly. What it was. You weren't anticipating its release on Netflix.
I knew nothing of it other than just what, the
you'd
little
seen
description.
The book at some point.
I'd seen the book. I'd seen them talking about an IO9 and stuff, but I had no notion of the story other than what you just read in like little description. So this was great, right? In the sense that I got to come in completely fresh, spoiler free. That is rare these days. So cool. It was good to just, kind of jump in, and that I think just made it all the more enticing. Also enticing was the fact that they cast this thing with, much like Carnival cast a bunch of B and C level actors and just let them shine. This did the same thing. Eddie Marzan, who you've seen, he played Detective Lestrade in the RDJ Sherlock Holmes movies. He's in Mission Impossible 3,
right.
strangely. He's this little sort of hobbit guy that you keep seeing pop around. He's the lead. He's Mr. Norrell, or Mr. Norrell, as he's sometimes referred to. And this other guy, Bertie Carvel, I forget what he's in, but he's Jonathan Strange. The Thoros of Myr from Game of Thrones is in it. And like he basically just wandered in wearing his Thoros of Myr costume.
Whoa.
It was, I mean, he's got tattoos. So there's all these like sort of like lower level British actors you've kind of seen before who just get to just own their scenes, own their characters. That was really cool to see. So there's a lot of sort of kind of familiar faces, but it doesn't get in the way of the story, right? It's not like, oh, there's that guy. Oh, it's kind of like, man, I know that guy from somewhere, and dang, he's settling in nicely. So the story, before we get too far in, the story is about well, really, it starts off with one guy, Mr. Norrell, who is in Britain in I think like the 1700s, maybe 19th century, I think. So maybe early 1800s. And he collects magical books and is kind of what is referred to as a practical magician, in that he reads, he studies, he's kind of a historian, but he also practices it and does stuff. And it's his goal to bring magic back and do it in a dignified way and really make it about, make magic not this, they always refer to kind of like, magic when it was, 300 years prior, when it was about, witches and wizards and, nonsense. And he wants to make it an actually a dignified sort of art. And
so I got a question for you right there. Yeah. Does that mean that they acknowledge that back in the day it did exist? Like, yes. Is this a world in which they recognize that magic existed?
Yes.
It's just sort of lost its dignity.
Yeah, well, it existed, okay. And so there was this character called the Raven King who gets referred to a lot, and he was sort of like the last bastion of the old magic, and it was, and so society had kind of moved on. So magic has kind of become more legend than anything else. And there's these other, again, the opening episode starts with this kind of like the Society of Magic with these guys, and all they do, they don't practice it. All they do is kind of sit around a table and drink and talk about how magic used to be. And, they're more like, there's practical magicians, and then there's like theoretical magicians. So they're the magicians who just sort of, read books, and they're constantly bitching about the fact they can't get any magic books anymore because Gilbert Norrell has them all. And so they go and they kind of, they start to really, investigate that more. And Gilbert Norrell, to try to shut them up, says, all right, if you come here and I do a feat of magic, you have to promise to disavow or to break up the society and stop pursuing magic. So all right, fine. They kind of treat it like it's, like a joke. Like, well, he doesn't really know. Like, no one's seen magic performed in 300 years. So it's like, he's not going to do it.
Well, I have another question for you right there. Yeah. So about the 300 years, are those 300 years roughly analogous to actual history? Like, is it like the queen of England, or king or queen of England at this time is the one that really was the queen?
Yes. Okay. It mirrors the actual history pretty closely.
Okay. So it's not like an alternate history. It's a real history with alternate circumstances.
It feels like that because there's a parliament. It's like England is settled in France, and all the cities and Venice exists, and like all the stuff exists. There's a war between France and England. So it's all of that's still in place. It's just that this idea, and the thing about that I really like that you, especially on the second viewing through, you really start to see all the metaphors to actual English society and class, and especially like the North versus the South. In the modern timeline, or the actual timeline, the North has become kind of analogous to the U.S. South in that it's kind of more rural, it's very industrial. It's kind of looked on in England as kind of like the lesser of England. Like the people in the South kind of look at the North in sort of a snooty way, like the North, those Northers. In this story, it's prior to industrial, England, and so the North is almost like the backwards that's where the magic was, right? So that's where it's almost like those people in the North. It's mysterious and it's magical, and it's still kind of the other, but it's for those reasons, not for like industrial.
That's a really cool twist.
And so you get kind of like that same classism kind of exists in that way. The whole thing is really like Downton Abbey and Harry Potter kind of merged together. It's interesting in that way. So you get Gilbert Norrell. He brings this society over, and you get to see some of the people in the society kind of keep popping up in various ways as the series goes on. But he actually does. He invites him to this church, and he's still in his mansion. And he does this feat of magic where he brings all the stone statues in the church to life, and they're all like speaking like nonsense, like weird, like cryptic kind of words. And so the guys who are there, like half of them are like kind of awestruck and wonder, like, oh my God, he actually did it. Half of them are running around like completely scared out of their minds, not thinking he may have, summoned the demon or something like that. So that event causes a big stir, and everybody starts to talk, the press gets wind of it. And so everybody starts to talk about it. He uses it. And Mr. Norrell has this really great manservant who's kind of like, he's less his manservant and more his kind of like, friend and confidant. And he also sort of is skilled in magic as well. His manservant tells him, he's like, you got to use this event to actually go to London and get yourself into the graces of Parliament and society and stuff. So he does. So they go down there. The whole time, he's constantly just Gilbert Norrell. He's very fun, he's like a stickler about everything. He doesn't like people really. He just wants to sit in his library and read his books, but he wants magic to be respectable. So he wants to accomplish that, but he doesn't want to go to parties. He doesn't want to do all these things. And he kind of keeps getting solicited into like, going to this guy's house because he's got this party and that will help him get noticed more. And all these things kind of happen. So eventually he does get in with, I think not the prime minister, but like the next guy down, like the minister of defense or something. He gets in with that guy and, finally, kind of proves himself to that guy and gets in there. Meanwhile,
so why would he do that? Why, I mean, what's it just for the sake of magic, like having its honor restored?
And he wants to use magic to like help England win the war. And
okay. England there is some sort of patriotic reason for it.
Yeah, and he just really wants it to be dignified, and he wants to, he wants to be known as sort of a major force in British history, as like this, as a gentleman magician. And again, it's very much about that. And like he wants to do away with like, talk of fairies and all this kind of stuff. He doesn't want any part like that. That drug us down. That made England less dignified. That sort of drug our name through the mud. I don't want to be part of that. I want to bury that. And we're going to make England. And he almost treats it very clinically, like it's like a medical profession. Like that's kind of where he is with it. Meanwhile, further north, there's this guy, this sort of son of a wealthy elite named Jonathan Strange. And he's kind of bumbling around, and they show you a couple scenes of him like not knowing what he wants to do with his life. He's tried a bunch of different stuff. He's kind of a spoiled sort of, spoiled son of this guy, this land baron. He's chasing after this woman he's in love with. Her brother's the priest. And so you kind of get his story. And then very early on, his father dies. So he inherits his father's estate. And he thinks, okay, this is now, I'm finally going to have, be able to marry this woman, and I get to, kind of figure out what I'm going to do. He runs into Thoros of Myr from Game of Thrones. I forget what is he called in this? He's not called Thoros of Myr. He's called, oh God.
And this is not the Raven King.
No. But this is a guy. Thoros of Myr's got tattoos all over his body. But that character's constantly talking about the Raven King. He's like, oh, the Raven King. And he actually runs into Mr. Norrell early on too. And Mr. Norrell is kind of like, get him out of here. Like we don't want. So that actually, he goes to the north. He runs into Jonathan Strange and he says, oh my God, you're part of this prophecy. There was going to be two magicians and you're one of them. And he's like, I am? He's like, yeah, you are. So he kind of takes that to heart. He's like, well, that's cool. Maybe I should study magic. So he kind of he doesn't have access to any books. And there's this running joke that Gilbert Norrell has bought. He's like the patron saint of bookstores because he's bought all the magic books and has basically hoarded them for his own, right? So nobody can get a hold of magic books anymore because Gilbert Norrell bought them all. So Jonathan Strange is trying to he's gotten the whole like pamphlets and this just random bits of pieces of information. So he and his friends kind of go off, and his fiance, he tries to kind of figure out how to do magic. And eventually the two guys end up meeting and form this friendship and form this relationship. And, Gilbert Norrell is very clinical, very, historian, very academic. He kind of reminded me of that character from Harry Potter. He's like, it's just purely academic, Mr. Potter. Like that guy, Slughorn. Whereas Jonathan Strange, you can tell more and more is fascinated by what magic used to be and really wants to, he's like, we should be looking into this stuff. He's like, why don't we, Norrell won't really let him delve into the past and really try to, work on some of those spells and figure that out. So there's kind of like this, you can see early on, there's this rift between the two, even though they really respect each other. And at some point, the government has them put up like beacons to sort of keep the French fleet away. And a lot of what Gilbert Norrell does is kind of, they show him doing some tricks, but a lot of what he does is kind of invisible or is harder to quantify. Whereas Jonathan Strange, at one point, and this is kind of where a really cool turning point. At one point, Norrell's away, and they're like, "Hey, one of our ships tipped over because of the beacons that Norrell put up. Like, we need you to come fix it." And he's like, and Jonathan Strange's like, "Well, I don't really think I should." Like, no, come on, we need you out here. And so he goes out there, and then there's this giant, British fleet ship tipped over on this sort of sand jetty or something, and he doesn't know what to do, and he kind of invents the spell out of nothing and causes like all the sand on the beach to form horses that tip that charge at the boat and tip it back over again. So it's visually, they show you like actual magic being performed, like, right? It's not like they just talk about it and never, like, they actually show you some really cool stuff happening, but it's still like, there's like this group of people watching on the beach, and they're almost just kind of like, oh, that's just jolly good, isn't it? Like, nobody's really like
impressed.
Nope. Well, they're impressed, but nobody goes, oh my God. Like, if anything, they're just like, oh, bravo, sir, bravo, well done. Like, nobody's like taken back, or they kind of get to the point really quickly where magic is just accepted and not this like crazy demon thing that, like, kind of in the very beginning it was. So he does that, and right away they're like, oh my God, you're actually more powerful than Mr. Norrell. So we want you on the front lines. So we're going to send you to the peninsula. They're always talking about the peninsula where the war is going on. So they send him over, and I think, it's not Cornwallis or Cornwell or Cromwell. There's like a legendary British general who's there who takes him in, and like, again, and everybody in the army is kind of like, magic. Why are we messing around with this? Eventually, though, they kind of see the value in it too, and then they almost expect too much out of him. So you get to see Jonathan Strange. He goes to war while Mr. Norrell's back, kind of furthering his cause. And the two, it's over the course of 7 episodes, the two have this relationship that grows tenuous at times, and it's friendly at times, and then they're rivals at one point. And so you get to see that unfold. Meanwhile, and that's all one kind of story arc.
Well, let me ask you this, because the effect of like summoning these horses out of the sand, what are the effects like in this? Or like, are they good?
They're really good. No, they're really, it's not cheesy. Like, he kind of conjures the spell. He gets frustrated because he doesn't know what he's doing, and he thrusts his hands into the sand, and then all of a sudden, like, this kind of earthquake effect happens, and you see the sand kind of form and below, and then it forms the horses, and the horses hit the thing. So I would say any of the effects you see in this show are right on par with Game of Thrones.
Really? Okay. Yeah. So that's huge.
It's good. Yeah. It's like, that's what I'm saying. This show, for being a BBC production, is really well done. Like, they really and there's so many gorgeous shots that just the scenic design, even just really well staged, really well shot. Like, it's just pretty to look at, right? You want to visit this version of England. You're like, geez, this looks good. So that's the main story arc, is those two guys and their relationship. Meanwhile, there's this other story arc that kicks off pretty soon too, where as Mr. Norrell, or as Gilbert Norrell is and there's another running joke too, by the way. His name is Gilbert Norrell, but as everybody's kind of hyping him up and trying to befriend him, and they refer to him as Mr. Norrell, like that's kind of like, and that just drives him more nuts, because he's like, my name is Mr. Norrell. Like, he doesn't like people in that way. But early on, when he's trying to make the acquaintance of the Minister of Defense, that guy's fiance falls deathly sick and dies. And so they bring him over, and this is before he meets Jonathan Strange. They bring him over, and they're like, can you do anything to help her? And he's like, I guess I'll try. He goes up to her room, and he's like, he has no idea what to do. He's like, he's like, I'm not going to do black magic, because I've sworn not to do that. And he thinks to himself about, like, at one point you could summon a fairy to help you. And as soon as he does, this guy appears who's, very clearly a fairy, but kind of reminds me a lot of, just has kind of the vibe of David Bowie in Labyrinth, which you haven't seen, which we'll talk about another.
No, I have actually seen Labyrinth.
Oh, you have? Okay.
But I only saw it in my 30s. That's the problem with that movie. Yes.
But this guy in the book, he's referred to as the gentleman with the thistledown hair. That's never mentioned until the very, very, very end in this.
Okay.
But he's clearly like this fairy that has like Beethoven hair. He's got like, he's very well dressed, but it's kind of like, a woodland style, like, English gentleman's outfit. And he's very
so like literally, like, I mean, like, so these like fairies exist in this world.
Yeah.
Okay.
And
Okay.
we only see this one though, and he's a regular. He's as tall as a regular person, but he's clearly, he's got like kind of elvish ears and features and things. But he himself is very much dignified and wants to, So it's kind of an interesting sort of mirror on Mr. Norrell, and he offers Mr. Norrell his help if Mr. Norrell becomes his sort of pupil / slave. And Mr. Norrell's like, well, no, I'm not going to do that. I don't want anything to do with you. I just want you to fix this one thing and then be off with you. And he's like, all right, I'll bring her back to life, but I'm going to make a bargain. And the bargain is half of her life is mine. So he's like, I'm going to bring her back and half her life is mine. He's like, and Mr. Norrell goes, oh yeah, okay. So when she's like 40, I think in the story, she's like 23. He's like, so when she's like 40, then you get to have her. And he doesn't really respond to that. And he takes her pinky finger as like payment. He just kind of pulls it off of her, and he keeps it. He's like, this will be a token of the deal. And then you come to find that what he meant was not that she'll live half her life and then get to live with him, is that when she falls asleep, then she goes into this other fairy world and she lives with him. So she slowly starts to go mad, because every night instead of sleeping, she ends up getting whisked away to this labyrinth world where she dances with him in this courtyard, in this kind of creepy, fairy mansion that's all dilapidated. The mansion is called, I think, the Mansion of Lost Hope, or the world is called like Lost Hope. They refer to it that way. So Mr. Norrell from the outset is like, he's made this deal with the devil essentially that he's continuing to regret, and that just pushes him further to, anytime Jonathan Strange asks about fairies or asks about deep magic, he's like, no, we're not going to talk about that. The matter's closed. And he never tells him what he did until way later on. Like that kind of comes back out again. So you get to see this fairy, and he's got a bunch of different motives, and he ends up befriending the slave. Well, not the slave, the house, like the lead house servant of the Minister of Defense. And so he ends up kind of employing a lot of these people in his plans and stuff. And he's got like all these sinister motives. So there's that story arc as well. And then it all kind of comes to a head at the very, very end. And something happens to Jonathan Strange's wife that is just, it's crazy. It's heartbreaking. You're like, oh God, you get reinvested in the show in a whole new way. So that like about midway through, when you're like, okay, I think I know where this is going, they sort of change it up on you in a really interesting way. And they make it about something completely different. And you're like, oh, wow. Or they kind of take you on a new chapter that's just as compelling. So the whole thing is wired together really, really well.
Would you say it is more concentrated on those sort of interpersonal dramas between these characters, or is most of the big action about like the war and then being co-opted into government service and stuff like that? I mean,
kind of both. It's kind of both. There's a lot of really good development, but we see a lot of there's a lot of scenes of Jonathan Strange on the front lines, performing actual magic. Like, and at one point he has to do black magic to bring these these guys from the opposite side who died back to life so they can tell him what happened, but then he doesn't know how to make them dead again. So they're just there. They have to burn down the house, and that gives him like PTSD. He's constantly talking about it. Yeah, it's kind of grim and grisly and everything. So when he gets back, I'm spoiling the shit out of this whole thing, but like when he gets back from war, like he has PTSD so badly, he says, I'm not going to perform magic ever again. I'm just going to be a theoretical magician and write a book, and that'll be that. By that point, though, Norrell is kind of pissed at him for a number of reasons. So there's like that rivalry continues on. So you get to see a lot of it's one of those shows very much like Stranger Things, where you finish an episode and you're just like, oh God, that was just one episode? It felt like 4, like packed together. Like, how is this just one? Really, in fact, very much like Stranger Things in that respect, very considered. Like every minute is used very, very well. Like nothing was wasted story-wise, which I appreciate.
Interesting.
So yeah, it has a lot of the sort of wonder and sort of intrigue of Harry Potter and a lot of the magic, but there's not like people running around like screaming Avada Kedavra at people with wands and stuff. Like it's very, the people who can actually do magic are just Strange and Norrell, and then his Norrell's manservant, and maybe like the fairy, obviously, but it's very limited. At one point too, that they end up getting called to the king who had gone mad, and they're like, we want you guys to come and try to help the king, and they're standing there in the sort of the receiving room, and Jonathan Strange tells him, he's like, we're helping the king. Now we can say we can do magic by royal appointment, and that's very dignified, right? And it's like they're still chasing that, like we want magic to be dignified.
That sort of legitimacy for their
But then eventually Jonathan Strange gets really into sort of like the Raven King and everything, and he really he figures out how to get to the land of lost hope, and he's like, we should be using these passageways, and so there's a lot of really cool stuff there too, and just it is the perfect balance of Downton Abbey sort of class interpersonal conflict stuff, sort of the magic and wonder of Harry Potter, and just sort of good Game of Thrones style, mythology, and it balances all those things really, really, really well. Not any one of those things overwhelms the other. So it's not like you get so much, visual effects that you're just like, okay. I mean, it's used sparsely, and when it's used, it's really well done. And just in the same measure, like you don't get so many like people in a room just talking where you're like, oh, it really justifies every scene, and it justifies every, the action is really well placed. And I don't know, I will watch it a third time and love it just as much and see more things that I didn't catch the first time.
Interesting. Now, do you know anything about, like, are they planning to do more things in this world, or does this story kind of wrap it up?
It wraps up one of the main sort of threads, but it very much, the very last 10 minutes are clearly set up to give you another season if they decide to do one.
Gotcha.
There's a big, huge what if that you're like, oh, and then they really tee it up nicely to jump back in if they ever want to.
I did see when I read a little bit about the author, because I too had always been intrigued by that book and the cover and didn't really know what it was about. That when I Googled her before our conversation, saw that she began working on this more than 10 years before it was published.
Yeah.
And so during that time, she was publishing short stories from the universe of it.
Oh, neat. I didn't know that. I'm gonna read those.
Afterwards, her second book is actually a collection of short stories, which I assume that's what they're talking about, but it's all focused on the women.
Yeah.
So it's like Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell is about the relationship of those two men mainly, and then there's a collection of short stories.
Well, you get to see. Well, they do focus on like, so the woman who he saved, who then goes crazy, and then like Jonathan Strange's wife. Like you get a lot of scenes with those people too. So it does. It's strange. It's called Jonathan. No pun intended. It's a little odd. It's called Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, they're the main characters, but it doesn't. You spend a lot of time away from those characters too, right?
Right.
What they want and what they do in the world and who it affects, you spend just as much time with those characters and trying to understand, what the repercussions are and where they go.
I mean, back to our eternal conversation about Netflix kind of shows and stuff like this. Like, if there's a universe, like we've talked a little bit about this as far as the upcoming American Gods series, and like how much of that are they going to pull from the sort of expanded universe? Mm-hmm. Because there's a novel, American Gods, and then there's another novel that has to do with the characters, but not the same characters, correct? And we know they're using that information in the show American Gods, and it sounds like maybe they've got the same thing for Strange and Norrell. Like
the difference
she's
there
got a couple of books, and
Neil Gaiman's done American Gods, and then there's a sequel called The Nancy Boys, which follows one of the characters from American Gods and more or less his kids. But Neil Gaiman has said, he's been very open with the show to say, you guys can use whatever you want,
right? And
feel free to invent enough to build this world out, to do as many seasons as you like. He's being very generous with just the world. And it's like, you can kind of opposite from Game of Thrones, where they're like, we have to follow the books. He's like, no, you've got this book, but I'll give you story ideas. I'll give you whatever you guys want to do. I am basically part of your team now. in terms of old content and any new stuff. So let's continue the story on, which is cool.
Well, I wonder in a lot of ways if Game of Thrones is showing people how not to do it.
Yeah.
Like if you come out of the gate like we are a super faithful interpretation of the books, when you aren't able to fulfill that expectation, those book readers really turn on you.
From what I understand, this does follow the book pretty. Strange Norrell follows the book pretty well, but I wonder because she has to. Apparently, she's got to finish like the next like book, like the actual sequel of the story.
Gotcha.
And from what I've read, there's some discomfort around like, well, is she gonna finish it? We really want to do another season.
So maybe you told me about that, or I read that, before our conversation, that there was some sort of worry that she won't finish before they have to go into production, and they're just going to go into production anyway.
Well, and they haven't started production. I mean, they haven't planned it, but this has become so successful that I wouldn't be surprised if Netflix doesn't go to the BBC going, we're going to co-finance this with you. Let's make this happen. We want this next year. Like, and so in that case, if BBC owns the rights to the story, they can kind of do whatever they want. I mean, obviously they would probably consult her, but it could go horribly wrong too. I mean, she really did a great job. And if it took 10 years to write this thing, I can see why. It's so nuanced and so detailed. And so, it juxtaposes with actual history in such a cool way that, and here's the best part though. If it takes them 5 or 6 years to make a sequel, it won't be weird because the way they left the story would allow for that. You could very easily pick up 10 years from now when everybody's 10 years older, and it wouldn't feel like, oh man, they can't do it now because everybody's older. Like it would totally work. So, it's kind of, they're kind of in a really great spot with it, but there's so much more I could say, but I've spoiled so much, and it's one of those things that you just got to kind of drink in. And I mean, there's so many little things that are just little moments where you're like, oh my God, like that. Just little things that they do so very well.
Well, you talked a little bit, I asked you about the magic and how real those effects work, but the same question about like the setting of it. I mean, if it is 19th century, does it feel like, budget in any way, or does it look like pretty legit?
It looks, again, a lot of BBC stuff you've seen today does have that budgety feel where like, you can see the constraints.
Yeah.
This looks just like, it looks just like it would if they were to shoot Sherlock Holmes, RDJ, or any of those. And in fact, even better because they don't rely on green screen a lot. A lot of it's just practical sets, practical locations, just really set designed really, 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 really well.
Right.
So yeah, I didn't feel that whatsoever.
Well, one of the interesting things I dug up when I looked it up was that there was a quote from, of all people, George R.R. Martin, saying he watched the series before he read the book, and in his mind, you could appreciate one or both of them. Like they were both so, I guess, complete in that way and effective, like in their own way, that you didn't feel like you missed anything. Mm-hmm. by just consuming one or the other. And I don't know, I would say that things I've seen from BBC lately have really amazing production value.
Oh yeah, so, don't get me wrong.
But they definitely have that reputation of being like masterpiece theater or something.
Yeah.
Where you think like, oh, if it's a period piece with magic, it's gonna look like an old Sherlock Holmes set with like a lot of smoke or something.
Yeah, no, good Lord, 80% of this thing is shot outdoors too. So it's
wow.
They really go for it. And the other thing too is like there's this, you will watch this and then want to go collect antique books like crazy. Like this thing really plays into, books were the Netflix of that time, like book publishers were like, were massive. And so like, everything from Norrell's love of books and his library to just how the culture interacts with books is really cool. You get a really nice blast of that time, that era, the sensibilities of that era, even the diseases and the dangers of that era.
Yeah.
It doesn't make it so fantastical that it's not believable.
Well, so I got another question along those lines. Sometimes when we see like historical dramas like that, these days they suffer from there seem to be two extremes they go to. One is that they're like either so cliched in like the stereotypes we've seen of characters,
Mm-hmm.
that it kind of weighs it down. Do you feel like these are like wholly original three-dimensional characters? I mean, is this something we haven't seen before? Or is it masterpiece theater with magic,
No, see, now that you say that, it's
Well, I
not,
guess the contrast to that is I think of the Robert Downey Jr. Sherlock movies where it's like they go the other way, where it's like, here's the extreme take on,
oh yeah,
I always think of like Sherlock Holmes Guy Ritchie movies as like, oh, right, the historical 18th century ninja from England.
yeah, no. It's definitely not that, but it's definitely not as mundane as masterpiece theater with magic.
Yeah.
It's somewhere in. It has the nuance and sensibility of Downton Abbey, because Downton Abbey is a very rich, detailed world, but it's not just. I mean, it's got a lot of the sort of the sensibilities of Harry Potter too, and the mystery, and just sort of know. So it's a nice juxtaposition of those two things. I think the characters, by the time it's done, you get a really good three-dimensional sense of most of the characters.
Yeah.
In the beginning, especially with Mr. Norrell, he's very. You don't get a sense of his background, so you don't really know why he is the way he is, but his journey and his evolution is satisfying by the end. Because you do get to see, you're like, oh, I see. Some of his decisions that seem a little off-putting at first are you kind of get a sense of why he did what he did, or why he is the way. Like, it does really. By the time it's done, for both of the main characters, you're like, okay, I really understand. The only one who doesn't have that is the gentleman, fairy, who doesn't need it. I mean, he is a one-dimensional, like, in that that is sort of where the one-dimensionality lies in the magical world, where it's like there are these archetypes that are unbudging, because that they are archetypes. They are mythical archetypes, and they don't need to budge. Like, that's what they are. They just simply are that way. So like when you see them interact with the real world, I guess it almost heightens that for both sides a little bit more. So you're like, okay, here are these people that are changing, evolving. Here's this fairy who is exactly the same way he was 300 years prior and 1,000 years prior. It's like, he's not going to change. So that's interesting.
Yeah, and and in some way that's like complaining that like the Demogorgon doesn't have a personality or something.
Yeah, exactly.
It's sort of like, this is the magical creature that interacts with the actual three-dimensional human beings.
There is a lot of and be careful when I say this. It's not like a one-to-one comparison, but there's a lot of Stranger Things sort of moments that really layer on top of this really nicely. Like, at one point, somebody you've gotten to know and love gets taken to not just the woman whose life has been bargained away, but somebody gets actually like taken away from the world into the fairy world by the gentleman. Right. And then there's some of the last half of the series is trying to get that character back. And like so there's a lot of that going on. And then just like, even the way the land of lost hope looks very much sort of echoes the Upside Down. And I know, like, neither show referenced the other, I'm sure of it, but just, it's kind of interesting that they sort of have this. You can watch Stranger Things and watch this and go, oh, okay.
This is the English Stranger Things.
And in some ways, but again, it's not that story directly, right?
Right, of course. Like, and I may have asked this earlier, so I'm sorry if I'm repeating myself, but how long is each episode? Are they an hour?
Oh God, that's a great question. They feel like they're about 3 hours each. They feel like little mini movies. I mean, they pack so much in. You're just like, Jesus. I'm going to say an hour. Shoot, let me just look in Wikipedia.
Interesting. Well, it's funny because, and I'll tell you one of the other funny nuggets while you look that up.
60 minutes. Yep, you're right.
Okay. So each episode is 1 hour, and there's 7 episodes. So that's not a bad miniseries.
No, but I'm telling you, you will finish one just like Stranger Things and go, wait, that was just one? What? Like, it really does. They pack so much in.
Well, that's cool. I mean that, but it, sort of one of those. I don't know that we've ever talked about it directly, but we've definitely indirectly assessed, like, how do you get into stuff like that? Like, if you look at a show that people tell you, oh, this is cool, but there's 20 episodes of it and they're each an hour long, or there's just 13. I mean, even if you're talking about superhero shows, the Marvel shows, it's intimidating. We just said this in our last podcast. Like, it's kind of hard to look at Daredevil season 2 and go, yeah, it's going to be worth 13 hours of my time.
Yeah.
But 7 hours, spread this out over a couple of days, and like this, I'm much more intrigued by hearing you describe it than previously, because I did think it was going to be sort of the magic version of the Guy Ritchie Sherlock Holmes movies.
Yeah, no.
That's definitely what I thought. Just from
I shouldn't even use that comparison, because it's
you didn't. I did. I mean, that was so. Oh yeah, I guess you did say the RDJ Sherlock's earlier.
I may have inferred it, and I only did that so you didn't think it was Masterpiece Theater.
Yeah.
I was like, it is very much. It kind of stands on its own. It's something that we'll compare other stuff to down the road. We're like, it's got a sensibility that is very original and very organic to what it needs to be.
Does it feel like a Netflix show in that way?
Yes.
Like it's kind of like it's its own thing, and it's like a perfect capsule that you can just get into. And
100%.
That's cool, because in our last podcast when we talked about Luke Cage, we brought that up of one of the problems with those Marvel shows is they are tied into the other Marvel shows, and so it's a little bit harder to approach each as like a little capsule. Like, yeah, here's 6 hours of Luke Cage that I'm going to enjoy. It's sort of like you got to get into whatever the show is, you got to watch that whole season, and decide, and then judge it against the other shows. And so that's cool. That I mean, like I said, I don't think you spoiled anything. I think that set it up perfectly. Well,
and definitely if you're listening going, well, I think I've gotten a sense of it. Believe me, I have purposely omitted quite a bit of really fun stuff. It's so well shot. It's just so pretty to look. Like the scenic design for this needs every BAFTA ever, and probably did win, because it's so great. On a side note, and I completely forgot this too, the guy who plays Norrell's manservant looks exactly like Jaqen Hagar, and you're going to think it is him. It is not Jaqen Hagar. It's a different actor. But the whole time I'm just like, man, is that, because you're like, that's Thoros of Myr. That is Thoros of Myr. Is that Jaqen Hagar? Is it? No, but is it? No. He's got that same kind of vibe about him. Looks exactly like that actor.
When you said Thoros of Myr earlier, all I could picture was Tormund Giantsbane. The big redheaded guy who's also done these bizarre travel commercials in Europe and maybe even in the States. Yeah, and he's like, I'm the travel wizard. And it's like the corniest thing you've ever seen. Like when Shatner was doing those Expedia or Travelocity commercials or whatever Shatner did, and they like, it was that level of corniness. For the Tormund Giantsbane. Oh,
wow, you're right.
It's totally like out of character. You're like, what is going on? Because he looks just like him, like the same.
Yeah, he keeps the beard and everything.
Wildling beard and like crazy eyes. He's just in a crappy suit. So yeah, when you said Thoros, I was picturing that guy, and I'm like, how does he appear in this show and not sort of turn heads?
I mean, he is.
Thoros is definitely a little slimier,
and this character he plays is very, very similar. I mean, it literally is like he just walked off the Game of Thrones set and onto here, and they're like, okay, we're just going to give you a couple tattoos, well, a lot of tattoos, and just be a little crazier and go. And it has that kind of vibe to it. But yeah, it's. Yeah,
I had to look up his name. It's Paul K.
Paul K. Yeah.
Vinculus, right?
Yeah. There's a lot of Harry Pottery names in this thing too, so you got to kind of keep that going. But it's I'm telling you, man, like this. Oh God, there's so many more things I could get into, but I'd spoil a hell of a lot of it.
Well, I feel good about it. If you feel good wrapping it up right there, I told you before we started season 3 of our podcast, like we could literally just regroup every week and talk about what we've watched on Netflix, because
it's getting that way.
My wish list is out of control on Netflix, or my queue. So we talked about Luke Cage in our last episode. This is Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell or Norrell? Norrell.
Either or. He prefers Norrell, but a lot of people go Norrell.
Yeah, and Arc and Get Down and Easy and all these things that I want to watch. Now I'm interested in Daredevil, and yeah.
The Get Down I peeked at.
Oh, really?
I peeked at it. I probably need to give it a fair shake. It's intriguing to me only because Giancarlo Esposito's in it, and I'm like, man, I gotta give it some attention just for him. who played, of course, Gus Fring in Breaking Bad. Like, I will follow that guy to the end of time if he keeps that performance caliber.
Well, and it's Baz Luhrmann, right? And I don't have any like connection to Baz Luhrmann, but just the story of early hip hop. I mean, I just can't wait to watch the Get Down.
It definitely has sort of the wink and a nod to the camera sort of vibe from what I could see so far.
Gotcha.
Like we're at any point. Did you ever see that miniseries on MTV or VH1 about the Temptations from like 10 or 15 years ago that they ran like crazy?
Did.
Like they reran like every 2 months. Right. It has a lot of that because a lot of that was, or even like, what's a better example? Like any of those movies or like music documentaries where like the character will stop in the middle of the scene and like look at the camera and go, that's how it was back in the day. We always had to try, like it has that kind of vibe about it.
Yeah. I brought up Baz because I don't always trust his, like, I don't always like, he has instincts like that where I'm like, ooh, lost me. but
and it's kind of like, I know what,
but I do think he'll approach the music with respect, and that's what I like about it.
Well, and freaking Grandmaster Flash is in it as Grandmaster Flash, and nobody seems to care that he's 40 years older now. It's like, there he is. Like, he's actually playing himself. Like, that's got to be surreal.
Who else could do it?
A more modern sort of example is that Jersey Boys, where they'll be playing us, and like one of the characters will while still playing in the band, like on the Ed Sullivan Show, will stop and like break the fourth wall and like start talking about like that doesn't necessarily happen to the Get Down, but it sort of has that kind of like feeling like it could happen at any time, which is a little like, okay, well, all right. I mean, maybe I've heard people rave about it, so maybe I just need to.
Yeah, well, I only bring that up because there are a number of Netflix originals that I'm ready to dive into, in the absence of Game of Thrones or any of those other shows that we watch and talk about.
We're in good hands when Game of Thrones finally ends. Really good hands. I mean, Westworld is just on HBO alone. We could
really just let these things pile up until Game of Thrones, but we need something to tide us over until the next season, which we have a longer wait ahead of us.
Yep.
So, I mean, I'm good with wrapping it up there. How are you feeling about that?
I'm good to go. So where can folks find you?
I am on Twitter at HeyToddA, and that is the main place to find me and interact with me. Where can people find you?
Also on Twitter at Taylor Trask, and you can find the both of us on their.network.
Yes, look for this and other shows there. Their.network. All right, until our next episode of any show on which one of us appears, I'm Todd A, and you are
Taylor Trask. Bye.